Today, my name is Keith Harris. I have with me Stephen Budd and Joe D'Ambrosio, both managers of some standing. And I'd like to introduce the panel by saying that we're going to talk about transparency, but that's just a kind of a current buzzword in the industry. So I want to have a slightly different take on it. And this morning I saw an article in Music Business Week, which was an interview with the manager Scott Rodger, who manages Paul McCartney, Arcade Fire, and several others. And one particular section of the interview struck me. And he was talking about when he managed Björk, and how when he managed her, she would release an album, it would sell maybe 600,000 in the UK, it would sell 300,000 in France and 100,000 in Germany, and before you knew it, he'd be over 1 million sales. One of the people who is now one of his partners, a guy called Henry Village, who manages Rudimental. Last year, Rudimental had a #1 album that sold 22,000 copies in the UK. Now, whilst it's great to be able to clap yourself on the back for having a #1 album, when your #1 record is selling 21,000 copies, the business model basically isn't going to work. And especially for a manager, given that the manager is not going to get all the money from those 22,000 copies. And it occurred to me that actually managers still have a foot in several new business models. You know, they have part of live, they have part of merchandising, they have brand sponsorship deals, they have all kinds of ways to make additional money. But one person in the value chain of the traditional industry who hasn't been able to dip into that has been the studio producer. So given the way that sales have declined, and the dramatic way in which they've declined, how does the modern marketplace work for the studio producer who can't actually get revenue from anywhere else other than record sales? Or can they? Stephen.
Well, you asked this question because for many years, both Joe and I manage record producers. I also manage artists, but for decades and decades and decades, I managed record producers. And managing record producers when records sold well was quite a lucrative business. And when, you could have an album that sold, maybe over the period of a year, you'd maybe have 3 or 4 different clients who would have albums. Some would sell 2 million, some would sell 3 million, some would sell 500,000, but it would all add up, and your 20% of the producer's 3 or 4% actually was quite meaningful. But that changed quite dramatically over the last 10 years, as you know. And of course, the record producer, is an interesting cog in the chain, very necessary in terms of the overall ecosystem of the music business. But they're the one section of the music business whose only revenue is from record royalties and the advances that they might get paid from those record royalties. So when record sales started to decline quite substantially, it started having a dramatic effect on what revenues the producers could expect to earn. The record advances declined rapidly. And to give you an idea, in the UK, what year are we now? 2015. Okay.
I am. I don't know about you.
I've had a busy week. In, say, 2000, or 99, 2000, a good record producer who'd had a substantial number of hits could ask anywhere from, and I'll do this in US dollars, anywhere from $75,000 to $150,000 as an advance against the royalties that they would earn from record sales. These days, perhaps there are 10 people in the world who could ask for that kind of money and still receive an advance like that. But on average, producers are having to make records in the UK, let's call it, if they're lucky, they're going to get $25,000 to $30,000 advance maximum. And most are earning significantly less than that. I don't know how you would say it is in the US, Joe.
No, very close, yeah.
Right? So then you, as a record producer, you were earning an advance, and you'd expect that if the record was going to sell well, that you would recoup that advance, and that you'd start to get royalty checks and royalty payments.
So that's not happening. So
that's not happening.
So how are producers surviving? I think
So producers are surviving. The clients that I have, the client base has shifted. A lot of people have left the industry from the producer side of things. It's shifted towards those producers who are songwriter producers, those people who have their own studios that they can organize all-in deals with labels, artists or managers, so that there's a sum of money and it's up to the producer how they want to spend it, but they are making money from owning their own recording studio and hopefully paying off equipment hire or equipment rental purchase or even real estate purchase, so they're actually making money on the purchase of real estate. But they're also then having to look at completely different business models with artists, and depending on how that artist is approaching you, whether they're signed to a label or whether they're being handled by a manager or whether the artist is approaching you direct, and what level of funds artists have available to them to pay for their recordings, and often they don't have much. Producers are looking at other revenue streams, whether it is saying to them, okay, well, I believe in you as an act, I'm willing to put up my studio time, I'm willing to put my own time up for this, and I'm in effect investing in your project. And if I'm investing in your project, then I want to earn a share of other income streams. So those income streams could be, I want to take a share of your publishing, right? Or I want to take a share of your merchandise. Or I want to co-own with you the masters that we're making. And then if these are self-released, I want to make sure that I get paid first as a producer from sales, or from any licenses onto third-party record companies. So we're having to be a lot more creative because they're, as you point out, the producer is not earning anything from merchandise, from touring. Records are seen often as lost leaders. The record companies are demanding a share of live income, probably rightfully, in order to compensate for the fact that then they don't have the record sales, but they are building a brand for the artist. But the producer doesn't, benefit from that.
Okay, Joe, so are these the kind of deals that you are now looking to do for producers, where they have ancillary income apart from just record sales?
Two-part answer. Flying here, and for the past 14 years, we have not taken a piece of publishing or the master side or merch, but it's opened my eyes quite a bit, and I think it's imperative that the producer, young and old, experienced and coming up, in order to keep the business going, has to think that way, as artists have to think that way, because then there will be no revenue stream at all. Second part of the answer is, I've been fortunate. One of my clients, Elliot Shiner, in the States, has the L's sound system if you buy an Acura. So there's royalty stream, very healthy from that. Two of my clients, one former, the late Phil Ramone, Tony Visconti, I've done their book deals. Tony does speaking engagements, other clients do mix with the masters, and we pull revenue in like that, but it's nothing like the older times, as Stephen described, when the advances were healthy and the royalties were even healthier.
Okay, so if you, because you're an artist manager as well, Stephen, right? And you're talking about the producer wanting to get cut in for part of the publishing royalty. What do you think is fair in that respect? And if you're advising your artist about giving a producer part of the song, what would your advice be?
Well, I mean, I think people have to be pragmatic. If you want to make great records, great recordings, and that's going to be the cornerstone of what you build your career on, and quite frankly it is, the most important thing is, have you got a song? The most important thing is, have you got a chorus? You know, start with that. If you've got a chorus, then you've got the basis of a good song. And if you've got the basis of a good song, you better record that properly. So the first real interaction that the artist has with bringing their music to the world is the recording. And they better make damn sure that that recording is as good as humanly possible and captures, you know, whatever spirit they're trying to deliver to the public. And so it's an incredibly important moment. And that's a moment where, you know, if you're an artist and you've got a label, well, the label's going to pay for that recording, and that's one thing. But if you don't have a label and you want to do it and you need to do it and you need to get it out there and make it happen, you're going to have to be pragmatic about what you give up. You're going to have to think, you know, yeah, I need this to happen, and, you know, this producer can bring X, Y, and Z to this particular recording. He's investing time, energy, and money into it. You know, maybe I'm going to have to give up a share of the publishing in order to do that. Now, there's no set way of doing that. Whether you say, great, we're going to take a 25% share of it or whatever, is you have to look at what the commercial situation is at that particular moment. But I mean, I think everybody is in the same boat in that we want to make music, we want to get the music out there, we want it to sound good. We're going to have to work with each other within the new ecosystems to find ways to realise what we can.
And Joe, so if your producers, presumably several of them own their own studio.
Yes.
Yeah. So if they participate and they use their studio for an artist to make a record, do you encourage them, or do they encourage the artist that they should partner on the record? In other words, have a slice of the record for the studio time?
Well, there's a phrase called sweat equity, which is the time many of us put into what we do, and we get paid for it either with a paycheck or something. A producer who utilizes his time in his studio is not only giving you sweat equity, his time, but it's also giving you studio time. At some point, that has to be monetized, which Stephen and I have to do, explain it to the client. Half the times they think the studio's free. What, is the studio not free? I hear that all the time. No, the studio's not free. You have to somehow roll it into the advance, roll it into the back end, somehow make up for the time. As we spoke about last night, we used to make records. When I came into the business, Billy Joel, Paul Simon, it would take a year, 6 months to make a record. We now make records in 2 weeks, and some artists get it, and some artists are appalled. How are we going to do that? And I explain exactly how we're going to do that. We're going to get basics in 3 days. We're going to get your vocals in 2 days. We're going to do some guitars, some cello, and we'll probably have an extra day off to get a pizza. We'll have plenty of time.
So you don't take a week to get the drum sound?
We don't get Michael Beinhorn. That's who takes a week to get drum sounds now.
Okay, so let's get to the new ecosystem, new economy, because effectively artists are going to be giving up something, to the producer, right? So how do you expect the accounting to work? You know, is it from now on that artists hire a producer and they contract a producer? Because traditionally, the record company has done the deal with the producer. So how do you actually make it?
Well, it's slightly different in the States,
Right.
and in Europe. It's two different things. In Europe, the producer would be contracting with the record company, and the royalties would be deducted from the artist's account and paid to the producer. Right? In America, they like to make things more complicated, so you actually contract with the artist's company, and there's a letter of direction between the artist and the label, where the artist is telling the label to pay the producer, right?
And
except you have a right of audit against the artist and not the it's
and
pretty
presumably
tricky.
there's an extra layer of lawyers in there somewhere.
There's two sets of lawyers.
Two sets of lawyers, and you'll never hear a lawyer complain.
Okay,
You
so
know, and
how...
three sets of lawyers if you've got the producer's lawyer, the artist's lawyer, and the label's lawyer.
So that the artist can actually understand what's coming out of their money, how do you go about that? We're talking transparency now.
Yeah.
You know, so how does the artist understand what they're giving up, at what stage they're giving it up? Because I heard you say something about, you know, the producer gets paid first before, you know, once the record comes out, the producer needs to get paid first, their share back first, before the artist, presumably?
Yeah, if I'm representing the producer, I will write that into the agreement. And because the producer has invested that time and money, you don't want the producer, you know, who's invested time, the studio and all the rest of it, sitting there 3 years down the line and still not having received any payment. So what it means is that when they've licensed the record onto a third-party label, and the label says, right, we're paying $20,000 for these recordings, then either the whole amount gets paid off, the recording cost that was agreed, say it was $15,000, gets paid out of that, or a portion gets paid out of that and a portion will get paid out of future. Depends what you negotiate. I mean, there's no fixed thing about that.
Would the artist understand that the producer's going to be earning money before they are?
It depends if their manager's going to be is clued up enough and is going to be communicative enough in terms of how they talk to their artists.
Yeah. Because, you know, obviously part of our topic today is transparency, right? So, you know, I can understand the situation that producers have found themselves in. I can understand exactly what you say about the way they need to earn. But Joe, for instance, presumably because in America, the artist and the producer contract, do you make it very clear to the artists, you know, what the chain of payment is?
Absolutely. No, it's all up and up. We're a clean paying window. We are, sincerely, we're very transparent. I don't want problems, as Stephen said, 3 years down the road, litigation problems. We're incredibly...
I don't think the problems are in that area. You know, the problems of transparency are in, you know, actually what we're getting paid. I mean, okay, what we're getting paid for the records, how the, you know, what the royalties are, what the deductions are, all of those kind of things. I mean, that area can become quite boring.
which is why I'm choosing to talk about something else.
Yeah. Okay. But I mean, you know, I think, you know, the concept of transparency as a whole and how the ecosystem of payments, micropayments, payments for streaming, payments for downloads, and how we as a management community are encouraging people to be open and transparent about what actual deals are being done on digital deals, and we can probably go on to talk about that in a minute, I imagine.
Well, let me ask you a hypothetical question then, because where we started was that in the new ecosystem, the only way the producers can get paid is by changing the business model, right? So they maybe take a slice of publishing or whatever. If digital revenues were as much as we feel artists ought to get, would the producers be happy to go back to their percentage royalty split and not take a slice of the song, for instance?
Since we haven't yet taken a slice,
Yeah.
while I think that's ideal, it still seems far away from me
Yeah.
for them to give a better rate on streaming and things like that. But you were going to say something.
Well, you know, we're all looking at, you know, I mean, every section of the market is looking at how the pie is being cut up. You know, I mean, we have a belief that, you know, streaming ultimately, changing the topic slightly, but streaming ultimately is good and healthy for the future of the music industry. There are arguments about what revenues artists ultimately receive. according to the contracts that have been negotiated with their labels, and whether whether streaming is some way between a broadcast and a sale, and therefore that the contracts are not relevant to what artists are actually receiving, and that there should be more equitable remuneration. That's a massive area of contention, which is now coming up and moving forward. But what was the question?
The question was, if we get that, if the labels actually start to give artists more, will producers be happy to go back to taking a percentage of what the artist's royalty is, as opposed to taking slices of the songs? Because what I see in the business is you get what I can only describe as mission creep. When the bottom fell out of record sales, record companies said, well, in order for us to survive, we now have to get involved in merchandise, we have to get involved in, stream, every income,
live.
Book sales, films, live, anything that you have, we need to get involved in that now. just to make it work. Now, as streaming picks up and the revenues start to return from recording, revenues start to return to what they were, I can't see any sign of the record company saying, well, actually, we don't need to have all that stuff anymore. We can actually go back to the old model where we were the record company.
I think it's going to be a long time before revenues return to what they were.
No, yeah.
But there are some unknowns. But no, there are some unknowns at the moment in terms of legislation that will potentially affect things. Safe harbors legislation, royalty rates, and all sorts of aspects that people are looking at. And over the next 5 years, I think we're going to see, some quite significant changes and test cases that may well be fought about what people's royalty rates, are based on ultimately. The indications, I would think, ultimately is that, artists are going to end up getting a higher share of the digital pie. I think that is likely to happen, but it's a long way to go.
Yeah. It's one of the reasons why I'm asking the questions about blurring the boundaries, because when I started in the business, it was, I wouldn't say common, but it was still not unusual for the record company to also be the management company, to in some cases be the publisher, to be the live touring company. It was all rolled into one. And then by the early 70s, that got all unpicked, and it was unethical. And now we're back in the position where you have that again, where the record company is often the management company, is often the publisher, and the whole thing's getting rolled back. And I'm just wondering whether, across the industry, you see a time where we go back to relatively clean breaks between what the producer does, what the artist gets, what the record label takes, what the live agent takes, or do you think we are now in a situation where all those things are just going to be rolled into one bundle to be split in a new way?
To answer your question, just from the record label side, the thorn in my palm always is, without naming names, one of the heads of A&R in New York also has his own publishing company. So if Stephen is the artist on his label, you can bet that A&R person's songwriter's songs are going to mysteriously appear on his record. How do you A&R Stephen properly when you're worried more about your songs getting placed on albums, when he's trying to put out the best album he can make, and the A&R guy is worried about his publishing company, not he, the artist? I don't think that's ever going to go away, since that's been allowed to happen. And at the same time, there are A&R gentlemen in New York who are also managers of some repute, not ill, positive, but again, where's their focus? Their focus is on the band. Let's say they have 7 artist clients. As an A&R person, one of them is their managerial client. Guess who's getting all the attention? Talk about transparency, none.
That kind of thing is all, has
Does it happen here? Or in London?
To a degree. I mean, less than in the States, but it has happened and it does occur. But, I think looking just holistically for a second, if we're, again, talking about transparency, of course, we're moving to an age where the technology does allow for transparency. And it is possible to implement that if there's a will. And, developments this year, including, the concept of blockchain technology and the possible impact that that can have on making royalty payments a much clearer process. The implications of that are quite profound in conjunction with the other things that are potentially, the other legalistic aspects that are happening. But, but there's a lot of hills to climb.
But in a way, that's one of the reasons I'm asking the question. Because if we're getting to a world where you're going to start to get these fixed kind of micropayments, you kind of need a snapshot moment of what the involvement is in the various parties involved in a record. So, say if you take the snapshot 5 years ago, a producer would have been on a 3 or 4% royalty, because that's kind of what producers get. The artist would have been on 20% royalty, because that's what. But as the market moves, all of these lines are being blurred. If we're going to go into a new environment where it's all micropayments, somebody's going to have to set what is fair for everybody to get in order to set up that blockchain. At what point do you take it? Do you take it from where we were in traditional business, or do you take it from where we're getting to in the new business? Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely. And, there's various bodies, including the Music Managers Forum in the UK, who are doing a lot of work on this particular subject and asking those questions and asking, the music ecosystem is so incredibly complex and so unnecessarily complex. It's been built on 125, 130, 140 years of history, of copyright history, and of arguments between different elements of the value chain as to who gets what. But, the new landscape and the fact that we're transiting away from a physical marketplace to a digital marketplace slower than has been anticipated, and will take another 5 or more years before it's a real overbearing majority of sales are completely through digital, means that there's a very valid case to, unpick it and start looking again at how these things can be simplified. Now, of course, there's a lot of vested interests that exist who don't want that to happen. But the manager's role and management organizations' role is to encourage people to get around the table, to communicate with a view to reaching these kind of solutions. And in the last month, I should have brought this out before. There we go. We've, thank you very much, brought out, this is a book called Dissecting the Digital Dollar, which you may have heard about. It's available for free as a PDF that you can download from the mmf.net, the mmf.net. It's an in-depth look at the way the infrastructure is today and the challenges that there are, that we have, and which areas need to be looked at. And it makes certain predictions, and it has certain suggestions. I wholeheartedly recommend you get this. It's free. Read it. It's going to give you some, interesting ideas and information about where the industry is going in terms of transparency.
Okay, let me turn to things as they are now, Joe. Have you yet had a streaming statement for any of your producers?
This is a shameless self-plug. I manage, for about the last 7 years, Joe Zook, One Direction, One Republic, Pink, Katy Perry, Philip Phillips, Ella Henderson, and we get really healthy statements for Joe, and that's about it.
Okay, but what about the rest of you guys?
Non-recouped projects, to be honest.
Okay. So if you get a streaming statement, how many lines do you have to go through to audit to make sure you're getting the right amount of money?
We have a really good friend in Washington at Sound Exchange, so he's on the inside, which we cultivated organically. We're very fortunate. But if you don't have a friend inside, good luck. Because the statements are this thick.
So
and we print and try to go over all of them, but even once you go over it, you find discrepancies all the time.
It's been 15 years for me since I last audited a label for a producer. We used to do it regularly and find very large sums of money that had not been paid, but it's been a long time since we did that.
So why is that?
Just because the complexities of it, the cost of auditing, the lack of transparency, the fact that you can only audit in one territory, we're relying on things like, I don't know, when you look at songwriter royalties, and we do things like compare our songwriter, because virtually all songs are co-writes. Yeah. So we look at the royalties that our writers have received, either performance royalties or publishing royalties, and then compare those with their co-writer, who we may not manage, but we continue to have good relationships with, and look at the two side by side, and often you find that there's, for big hit songs, hundreds of thousands of dollars difference. And you go like, you wrote this song, it's a 50-50 split. How come you're receiving this and he's receiving that,
Okay, so then what do you do?
Yeah, well then you go back and start to ask some pretty heavy questions and, involve accountants and
so
all that kind of stuff.
Found the same thing?
And one particular case for us is we have a client who produced and a client who mixed, both royalty participants, a Christmas album, and forgive me for forgetting the name of this young operatic American singer, about 4 years ago for Epic. And I know what the budget was because I controlled it, because the A&R guy got very sick and actually passed away right after the project. So they can't tell me what they spent on the record because I spent it. And then they sold 800,000 hard copies.
Mm-hmm. That's a lot.
And I did the math, and they said, oh, we're still not recouped yet. And I said, you recouped if you had 200,000. And Sony in the US has a third party that deals with their royalties, and they'll talk to you for about 2 minutes on the phone, and then all of a sudden the phone call goes away. I'm not kidding. And they're only over in New Jersey, which is a half-an-hour drive away, but you can't make an appointment, you can't see them, you have to go after them. And at some point we will, my clients are reticent. The cost versus the return is something you have to consider, but I think there's plenty of money there, and at some point, I don't give up. At some point we're gonna go get that money. But there's transparency. Sony hiring a third party to handle all their royalty payments, and the label says, oh, don't call us, call them. And they don't want to talk to you. They're not the label anymore, they're the third party.
We could bitch about getting paid by labels. But,
what I'm quite interested in is the royalty streaming payments. You say that they're this thick. How can you go about checking those statements in any kind of cost-effective way? Because given that every payment is 0.0025 of a cent, how on earth are you going to make sure?
Well, here's
the way we do it in England is we do something called a desktop audit. This gets a bit technical, Keith.
Well,
right. But a desktop audit is when you take a snapshot, right, and you look at, so now streaming, if you want to have a printout, I think we were talking about this, if you want to have a printout of your streaming royalties, royalty statements used to be pretty thick. They'd be like that thick, right? 5 years ago. right? Now royalty statements, if you print them out, and we only look at them digitally, would be that thick, right? Like 3 foot high, right? Because of the lines of data. So it's impossible, right? So you take a snapshot and you say, let's look at the royalty statements for just this period, right? Not the whole 12 not the whole 6-month period. Maybe we'll just take this one line here, and make a much more micro snapshot of it, and then the accountants will go and analyse that and see if that actually stacks up with what they think they ought to be paid. But to be honest, you're asking the wrong fucking guy, because
and in the States we can get reports on plays.
My eyes just go like, what? I sort of nod like that, and my producers ask me, sort of like, yeah, so are we getting paid correctly? I go, ask your accountant.
All I was going to say is that 2 things. When we get our streaming payment PDF, we send it to a print shop, because it would be way too hard to break our printers at work to print out something like this, because Joe demands, will you please look at it? Yeah, over the next holiday I'll look at it. But we take a snapshot, and we look at radio plays, which you can dig and find out, and just do the math. How much airplay did Counting Stars get? How much airplay did Story of My Life get? And you can figure it out pretty close. Are we in the ballpark? But when we're getting high 5-figure streaming numbers, then then they're capturing a lot of the plays.
Yeah. Well, the reason I'm asking that again is because traditionally your royalty statements were made deliberately very complex. So it was very hard to understand.
Well, traditionally, producers were used as a profit center, right, by the labels. I don't want to turn this into a label bashing session.
No,
right?
Too late.
But traditionally, they were used as a profit center by the accountancy departments of the labels, because they knew they could make deductions against the producers' royalties and not pay them properly, and the producers were less likely to challenge that than the artists were likely to challenge it. And they'd make, if you think of the amount of records they were making, and the amount of statements that they'd have to produce, and if they underpaid the producers by 10-15%, that was a few $1 million a year that goes to the company's bottom line, right? So, but I like to think, optimist that I am, that the days of deliberately swindling artists and producers out of the royalties are coming to an end, and that there's a mindset which is shifting, and that's, maybe I'm a naive optimist, but there's a mindset that is shifting towards everybody starting to recognize that it's in everybody's benefits not to play that game anymore, and to be honest and work out that people get paid what they're supposed to be paid.
Are you that just optimistic, Joe?
Yeah, I have young kids. I'm in this for the long haul. I'm as optimistic as Santa Claus. I'm in this game. I think Stephen is too.
Santa exists, doesn't he?
No. One of the reasons I'm asking is because in the new environment, relatively small adjustments on large numbers can make a significant difference. So the whole transparency debate becomes very important, because just a minor shift in the amount that's being allocated to, and I started with the producers advisedly, because producers are kind of the smallest part almost of the chain. So if you make a small shift to a producer royalty statement, by the time it's been multiplied 10 million times, or 100 million times, if you look at, say, like Adele's YouTube streams in 3 days, that can make a really huge difference. How do we get on top of it to make sure that that transparency is there and that the figures start out correct?
Yes, Keith, how do we do that? What's the answer?
Take credit. The MMF is really fighting hard.
Yeah, absolutely. We're fighting hard, and I think the question is there's, like I said before, we're moving towards a time when things are going to be dealt with in a different way. I mean, it's happening. It's bubbling up. This is a constant, ongoing discussion that is there, that is not going to go away, and certain businesses are building their reputations on the concept of transparency. You know, there's certain, collection agencies, publishing companies, et cetera, who are now making a virtue of it, right? Yeah. And are making it much, much easier for the artist and producer to see what their real-time royalty payments are. And the technology exists, and the more that we encourage this as managers, the more that people will expect it to be the norm, and we won't be having to deal with the sort of arcane way that we've been dealing with it up to now.
Okay, so to come back then, in the new environment, where we started off talking about how agreements are blurred because, you might need a piece of the publishing, you might need a piece of this, you might need that gets very complex. Do you think that we are moving to a place where, in order to get transparency, you are almost going to need standard deals? So the artist gets this much, the producer gets this much, the record company gets this much, and then...
If we were living in Soviet Russia, that would be a fantastic thing. I mean, it's a nice idea, but the trouble is that it's anti-competitive, so that's not going to fly.
The more popular producer is going to get the better deal, and the younger guy is not going to get a deal as palatable as that one.
No, but if you get a standard deal, then everybody gets the same deal, and you make more money if your products get streamed more or sells more. Rather than having all these strange blurred deals where people are taking little pieces of other people's revenue.
I take what you're saying, because it's just about the volume of that you're actually selling. But there again, it's ultimately it's about different people have different negotiating positions and what they're able to earn according to their value. I don't think you can take that out of the chain.
The lawyers will never allow that to happen. They're out of work.
I think that's a good point at which to close the debate. We're right on the 6 o'clock mark. So I'd like to thank both Stephen and Joe, and thank you all for coming, and thank BMA for inviting us. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.